So in order to establish a system to navigate ourselves through what we can bring to the table, subjectively, and what we can bring to the table as objective thinkers, we might want to take a closer look at a method which John Zeisel explains in his own book, Inquiry by Design. John Zeisel sees the process of research very similar to that of designing. And that's helpful for us because, of course, we have a much more intimate understanding now of the different action steps required to design anything. Zeisel describes the process of designing as 3 incremental steps: imaging, presenting, and testing. In imaging, we develop our conceptual ideas. In presenting, we share those ideas with other people. And in the testing stage, we take the information that these other people give us and we weave them back into the considerations that we may not have already covered in our first phase of design. So as we know from Design Studio, the design process is far from linear. The first idea that we develop is very rarely the last one that we develop. And the cyclical process that John Zeisel explains reminds us that every time we take a drawing to presentation and receive critical feedback from those who view our drawing, it sets up other propositions and opportunities for us to go back and look at once more. So what I'd like to do is to kind of break down John Zeisel's 3 steps of that process and look at them in a little bit more detail. Firstly, we'll take a look at the early stages of the design process. When confronted with a new problem to solve, we first of all use a process which John Zeisel refers to as imaging. Imaging is our capacity to tap into our own personal reserve of images, ideas, and things that we've encountered in our personal life that may prove to be the basis for confronting the design and potentially later on solving the design as well. For relatively new designers, the sources of reference that we have in our imaging archive may again be governed largely by subjective experience. And as we go through our college experience, we pick up new references to different designers who have done work similar. We have examples of buildings that we've visited. We have experiences that have taken place in the studio that can embellish and start to kind of deepen the range of different experiences that we can bring into the imaging process. In the imaging phase, we already have ideas that we need to be able to grapple with at a much more conceptual level than later on in the process. At the imaging stage, we're talking to ourselves, communicating with members of our studio group, our peers, and not sharing these informations yet with the client. So at the early stages of imaging, we might talk about concepts. Concepts also relate to the research process. As we've experienced in Design Studio, concepts serve like a filter, where many disparate pieces of information can be compared to one central organizing idea. If those ideas are inconsistent or out of character with the main idea that we're working with, they won't pass through the filter. And slowly, by using the filter analogy, we push ideas through. Those that pass seem to fit with the bigger ideas that we're working with. This is helpful for our colleagues in the studio and also eventually for a client who may not understand where all of these random sources seem to be coming from. So applying concepts to the research process works in very much the same way. We create a filter that enables us to identify paths of inquiry which are going to be of less value to us later on down the road. If we can eliminate those avenues early, we can save ourselves a lot of time. One conceptual tool that we can use in the conceptual stage of a design project is to develop analogies. What analogies do is that they set 2 seemingly unrelated objects or topics together and use the more familiar of these 2 topics to help explain some of the complexities of the other. So for instance, in the case of a building which is designed for sustainability, we may find that in order to understand how the roof of a building can shade the interior, yet allow fresh air to move through the space, and the building can generate or recycle its own air, producing carbon dioxide back into oxygen, we may find that it's easier for a client to understand that concept if we use the analogy of a tree. So by itemizing those characteristics which are dissimilar, we can then focus on the features which are similar and subsequently better understand the main ideas that are driving our concept. In 1962, Herbert Gans, one of the leading sociologists of the time, used an analogy to describe the West End of Boston. This was prior to its substantial demolition and the recreation in the 1970s. What Gans described was the entire area operating like an urban village. It sounds like an oxymoron, doesn't it? The city, a dynamic, multicultural environment with a changing group of people moving through the city through colleges and work, to the village, a place where families and generations would rarely move. In contrast to the anonymity of the city, the village was a place where everybody knew one another's business. In his observations of the West End, Gans noted that there was an incredibly tight social infrastructure. Generations of the same family existed and coexisted together. And what Gans was curious about is by using the analogy of the urban village, was to look at other characteristics of village life that would seem to be incompatible with the urban experience. For instance, how would newcomers to the West End be accommodated? What would be the short and long-term effects of urban development that could theoretically push people out of the West End and subsequently alienate them or isolate them from their communities? Although these are only two of Gans's observations, allowing ourselves to just simply reflect on the different natures of urban experience and rural experience would also enable us to probably find many other interpretations, many questions, many problems that may also lead to this interesting relationship. Another interesting use of a conceptual analogy appears in The Hidden Dimension, a book written by the anthropologist Edward Hall in the mid-60s, which explains some of his experiences of living with different tribes across the United States and observing human beings' behavior in many different contexts, such as hospitals and institutions. Edward Hall's analogy that he used to explain his work was the personal space. What Hall understood was that in fact we all have a very different capacity to tolerate other people, and in fact each one of us moves around with our own personal bubble, which he referred to as personal space. This is one of many different dimensions or scales to space that we occupy, ranging from the personal to the public, and in each one, based on our culture and our own individual sensibilities and our upbringing, our biases and our predispositions, we all have a different perception of how big the personal space actually is. So again, using his analogy helps us to think again about different ways in which personal space has an impact on our lives. For instance, with a brief understanding of his analogy, let's think about the personal space inside a coffee shop. How does the open plan office configuration affect our ability to concentrate? All of these components beg greater questions, so the analogy serves as a conceptual vehicle for forcing us to continue to ask more probing questions as we proceed. But the goal in the initial imaging stage of your research process should again be considered just like the design schematic phase as well. This is a place where we put many different ideas down, we ask questions of ourselves that have yet to be answered. We also want to see variety in the ways that we're starting to explore an idea. And eventually, by looking at all of the component parts, we can then start to rearrange them in much the same way as your initial diagrams to see if there are commonalities, overlaps or relationships between the information that we're starting to process. Each small piece of the imaging process could be said to be a relative measurement, meaning that none of them on their own right have the capacity to define or shape anything. But as we start to kind of see each of these things in context to one another, we can then understand what we deem to be important. Bear in mind that at this stage, the concepts are a tool for organizing information. That won't pop out of the data that you present, but by comparison and understanding of these ideas as a holistic whole, we eventually form our research path. Your research at this stage can be anything. It can be focused as much on observing a photograph, paying close attention to an existing drawing, but then it can also involve studying GIS maps or taking a look at much larger bodies of information, statistics for instance. Use your natural curiosity all the way through the imaging process, and slowly you'll find a home in the information itself. John Zeisel refers to this as indwelling.